Hey everybody, this is Madeline. Welcome to week 4. This week, our lecture materials are going to shift from focusing on the assignments included in Project 1 to focusing on Project 2. In Project 2, you'll remember, and there's different sub-assignments in Project 2, but the overarching goal is you've chosen one of the publicly available population-based databases, and in Project 2, you'll be moving through the steps of data cleaning, data wrangling, is what I like to say, and data analysis in order to answer a research question that you develop and ultimately write a research paper. Y'all have already posted in Brightspace about your Project 2 research ideas and the database you've selected. Now, the first step in solidifying and justifying your research question is to conduct a literature review. A literature review is a comprehensive summary and analysis of existing research on a specific topic. The literature review that you conduct for this class, Project 2, is both in service of justifying your research question and will be a part of the introduction section of your Project 2 research paper. So the learning objectives for this lecture are to understand the purpose of a literature review, to discuss how to conduct a lit review, and to explain how to structure the introduction/lit review section in your research paper for Project 2. In this lecture series for week 4, you're going to hear from both me and Dr. Kelvin. Dr. Elizabeth Kelvin is the person who originally designed this class. She was actually the instructor when I took this class. So you're going to hear both of our voices in these lectures as we talk through the process of conducting a lit review and writing the introduction section of a paper. One note before I move to the next slide, Dr. Kelvin mentions Blackboard during the lecture. Just note that what she's referring to is Brightspace. So in order to talk about conducting a literature review, we also have to talk about citation management software. Using a references software like Zotero, EndNote, there's others like PaperPile, JabRef. These tools will save you so much time. I cannot overemphasize how much time they will save you. Citation software is a tool that streamlines the research and writing process by enabling in-text citation insertion while you're writing. It also generates automated bibliographies in various styles like APA, MLA, etc. So you can be looking at a paper on your browser and have a widget. I use Zotero, so I have a Zotero widget on my Chrome browser, and I can click it to automatically pull in all of the essential information from that paper into my citation software, and then when I'm writing my paper in Word, I can automatically insert the citation for that paper. It's a matter of 2 clicks, I believe. 2 clicks of a button. And then at the end of your paper, when you have all of your in-text citations set, it automatically generates your references. It saves you, again, hours of time. So for this class, you are required to use the citation software for the citations in your paper, and you have some options to select from. Again, you have Zotero or EndNote as options. There's also PaperPile, JabRef, etc. Zotero you can download online. If you type Zotero into your browser, you can download a free version of it online. EndNote you can download by going to CUNY SBH IT Resources for Students, and it's one of the downloads that will bring you to the CCNY libraries. So Zotero and EndNote are free to use, free to download, as are a lot of the other options that you can look into. If you haven't done so already, go ahead and download one citation software and start playing around with it, because it's going to start becoming really useful when you get deeper into the literature review. For Project 2, y'all have selected and posted about the publicly available dataset you'll be using. Among the options include the 2023 Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance System, Global School-Based Student Health Survey, and the Rapid Surveys System. These datasets, they're real datasets with real participants and are publicly available, and the sampling is conducted in a very specific way. It's what we refer to as complex sampling, in which in many cases, groups, geographic areas were first sampled, then people within geographic areas were sampled, and in some cases, sampling was stratified on certain demographic characteristics, so like participant age, race, ethnicity, or gender, or some other factor. We're going to teach you later on in the semester how you can analyze complex sample data, because There are certain things you have to take into consideration in the analysis. And this is why we've really emphasized that if there's a data set that you're interested in using that's not on this list, that you should be emailing us because we need to check, one, that it's available, there's publicly available data sets, but two, that it uses a complex sampling method. So in a moment, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Kelvin, who's going to talk about what happens next. So you've selected a publicly available data set that uses complex sampling. Now you can look through the websites of where that data is posted to see what information is collected, and all of this being a first step to the literature review that you conduct for Project 2.
So the first steps in planning your paper is to look through the websites of where the data is posted to see what information was collected, because you don't want to write an entire literature review justifying a hypothesis that you then cannot test with the data available. You also want to explore how the data was collected, because you want your literature review to justify the data you're using and the hypotheses you're testing. So you don't want to write a whole literature review explaining how all the previous research looked at cross-sectional data, and what we really need to do is collect longitudinal data and then find that all the data sets that you could use to answer this question are cross-sectional as well. You also want to find out what papers have already been published using the publicly available data, because you don't want to repeat what has already been done. And if you look on the websites for each of these publicly available data sets, you'll find not only the data, but also often they include some links to publications or lists of citations that have used that data. They usually have the code book available so you can see exactly what questions were asked in the survey and the distribution of the responses among survey participants. They might include the survey itself as well as other information about the data collection methods. So you really want to explore the website fairly carefully to see what's available there. And then when you do a literature search, you might also search on the data set, right? The community health survey data, and see what's already been published using that data set. And then you also want to look on Blackboard and see what your colleagues in this class are planning to look at, because you don't want to do exactly the same thing. Now, that said, it could be that there are two or more students who are looking at the same general topic, but they might be using different data sets. They might be looking at different twists on that topic. Some people might be looking at effect modifiers of one type and others at different effect modifiers. So kind of look at what other people are doing and make sure that you have a hypothesis that's somewhat different. The introduction to your research paper should not be too long. You are writing an introduction to a research paper. You're not writing a literature review. So keep your introduction to no more than 3 pages. And when I say 3 pages, I mean 3 pages, double spaced, 12-point font, 1-inch margins. Don't try to cram too much in there. And what you want to do in the introduction is use the literature to make a point. And what point do you want to make? Well, you want to make the point that your research question is important and fills a gap in the literature. So you want to organize the literature in the introduction to lead the reader through what we know about the topic and what we don't know about the topic, and how your research question will address what we don't know. So you're not going to be summarizing every publication on the topic. You're only going to be citing the papers that help you make your argument. This is sort of referred to as the justified argument for your research question. So what is the point, right? The point is, and your goal in writing that introduction is to justify your research. Essentially, the most powerful introductions that we read in the beginning of research papers are structured arguments showing what we do not know and showing that we do not know the answer to your research question, and explaining why we need to know that answer. So it's not just summarizing the literature, it's using the literature to kind of show where the gaps lie and why it's important to fill those gaps. So obviously, one of the first steps to writing that section of your research paper is going to be to read the literature on the topic about which you plan to write. And this will help you identify what research questions still need to be answered and which of those questions can be answered with the data that you have access to. You do not want your paper to do nothing more than show something that we already know, because that would just be a waste of your time in conducting the research and the reader's time in reading the product of your research.
Quick interruption from Madeline. This is one of those moments when you're going to hear me and Dr. Kelvin's voice back to back, and it's just to quickly add onto what Dr. Kelvin said, that totally correct, that for y'all's paper, you do not want it to focus on what we already know. The caveat is just that there is a need for replication in science. So it is more that we don't want to do studies about things that are very well established, but replication is needed as a part of making something well established. Okay, now that that's said, back to Dr. Kelvin now.
So think about your plans for a literature review, like reviewing all the literature available on your research topic. And how much literature do you need to review? In other words, how many papers you have to read before you're ready to write your introduction? What is the number and why that number? And then also think about how many papers you would then need to cite in your research paper and why you think that is the appropriate number.